The paper was stamped in red, 4 letters, 1 word, declassified. Beneath it a date, January 14, 2019. And beneath that a single line of text that had been locked inside a government filing cabinet for nearly 5 decades. Black Talon operational record, call sign Phantom. Confirmed engagement, distance 847 meters. Conditions hostile terrain, no wind gauge, no spotter. Outcome mission success, identity of shooter. Classified eyes only. That file sat in a basement office at the Pentagon for 48 years. No ceremony, no announcement, no name attached to any public record. The man who made that shot went home, took off his uniform, and never spoke about it again. His granddaughter had no idea any of it existed. She was standing on a dusty training field in Colorado on a Tuesday morning in March, waiting for her name to be called. Fort Carson sits at the base of Pikes Peak, where the high plains end and the mountains begin. In early spring, the air carries the last cold edge of winter, and the sun rises hard and fast over the eastern horizon, throwing long shadows across the gravel and the dead grass. The recruits of Basic Training Cycle 7 had been awake since 4:30. By 7, they were assembled on the main range, standing in 2 loose rows, shoulders tight, eyes forward. There were 23 of them. Cassidy Harlow stood near the back. She was 22 years old, lean and quiet, with dark hair pulled back and a stillness about her that did not match the energy of the group around her. She was not nervous. She was not performing confidence the way some of the others did, chests out, jaws, set eyes, scanning the field as though they already owned it. She was simply present, planted in herself in a way that took up less visible space than it actually occupied. She had been that way for 4 weeks, showing up, completing every task with a precision that the instructors noticed but could not fully account for. She did not make friends easily. She did not make enemies either. She existed at the edge of the group like weather that hadn't decided what it was going to become. Sergeant Breck Duval stood at the front of the range with a clipboard. 48 years old, former Gulf War infantry, 15 years of training recruits at Fort Carson. He had a broad jaw, close-cropped gray at the temples, and eyes the color of old slate that moved constantly, taking inventory of everything around him. He had trained more than 4,000 soldiers. He could determine, usually within the first 72 hours, who was going to make it and who was going to wash out. He had not yet determined what Cassidy Harlow was. He cleared his throat. The field went quiet. Today was the first live fire session, standard protocol. Every recruit would receive an assigned sidearm and complete a basic accuracy course at 25 meters. He began reading names: Crawford, Beretta M9, Weir, Sig Sauer P2, 2.6, Donovan, Glock 17. Blake Donovan stepped forward to collect his weapon with the ease of a man who had handled firearms since before he was old enough to carry them legally. He was 24, built wide through the shoulders with the relaxed confidence of someone who had grown up around people who assumed the world would accommodate them. His father ran a defense contracting firm on the East Coast. Blake had been told his whole life that he was exceptional. He had spent his whole life believing it. Webb, Glock 17. Marcus Webb took his weapon without ceremony. He was 26 from eastern Tennessee and had been hunting since he was old enough to follow his grandfather through the woods before dawn. He checked the chamber out of habit and stepped back without a word. The list continued. 11 more names, 11 more weapons. Then Duval looked down at his clipboard. Harlow. Cassidy stepped forward. Duval had the next weapon in his hand, a standard issue pistol, same as the others, and was already extending it toward her. She spoke before the exchange was complete. "Sergeant," she said, "I'd like to request a rifle instead." The air on the range changed. It happened in layers. The nearest recruits turned their heads first, then the ones further back craned to see. Then the whole formation shifted its attention toward the woman in the back row who had just asked for something no one had ever asked for on the first day of basic firearms training. Duval lowered the pistol. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Blake Donovan broke the silence at a volume precisely calibrated to carry across the field. "Farm girl from Montana wants to play with the big boy guns." Laughter moved through the formation and faded, leaving the silence afterward, feeling larger than before. Duval kept his eyes on Cassidy. "You have any background with rifles?" he asked. "Hunting family, yes, Sergeant." He waited for more. She offered nothing further. "This is your first day of live fire training," Duval said. "We run handguns first, every cycle. There's a reason for the sequence." "I understand the reasoning, Sergeant." He had a rule built over 15 years of doing this job. When a recruit acknowledged a limitation and did not retreat from their position, one of 2 things was true. Either they were overconfident and about to learn something the hard way, or they knew something he didn't yet. He had been wrong before. He had also been right more times than he could count. You get 5 rounds, he said. If you can't handle the weapon safely and accurately, you go back to the handgun course. No argument, no second request. Cassidy nodded once. Deal, Sergeant. Duvall walked to the secondary weapons rack and selected an M4 carbine. He ran the safety check, verified the chamber, and carried it back to her. When he handed it over, he watched her hands. She received it with both hands, muzzle down thumb, locating the safety without looking. She pressed the stock to her shoulder to test the fit, settled her support hand along the foregrip, and checked her sight picture. The entire sequence completed in approximately 4 seconds, fluently and without hesitation, the way a person does something they have done 10,000 times. Duvall said nothing. He walked her to lane 1 and set a fresh target at 100 meters. The other recruits had largely abandoned the pretense of preparing for their own exercises. Most had turned to watch. Several had taken out phones, cameras aimed at the lane, waiting for the recoil to drive the barrel skyward and deliver the lesson everyone expected. Marcus Webb set his phone down. He looked at Cassidy's feet instead, the way she had planted them, the slight forward lean in her stance, the settled architecture of her position. He had spent enough mornings in enough fields to recognize when someone had been taught by someone who knew what teaching actually required. He said nothing. Cassidy looked downrange. She did not rush. That was the first thing Duvall noticed. Most first-timers with a rifle, even experienced ones, want to fire quickly. The weight of being watched creates urgency. They pull the trigger before their body has finished deciding where it wants to be. Cassidy did not pull the trigger. She breathed in, then out, not fully, just to the halfway point where the chest stops moving and the body goes quiet. Her eyes settled on the target with the unfocused clarity of someone who has learned to see without staring. Her finger moved from the frame to the trigger, slowly, deliberately, as though she had all the time in the world and had decided to use it. The shot broke clean. She rode the recoil back and forward like someone leaning into a wave they had been expecting. She reset, acquired her sight picture again, and fired a second time, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, 40 seconds total. When she lowered the rifle and engaged the safety, the range was completely quiet. Duvall raised his binoculars. He focused on the target. He looked for a long time. Then he lowered them and stood very still. Marcus Webb walked forward without being asked. He unclipped the target from the frame and carried it back, holding it up in the morning light where everyone could see. 5 shots, 1 hole. Not 5 holes clustered tightly. 1 hole slightly elongated at its margins, with a diameter fractionally larger than a single bullet, the only possible explanation for 5 rounds fired from 100 meters landing at the same point of impact. The grouping that experienced competition, shooters spent years attempting and rarely achieved, even rested, even in favorable conditions, even with all the time available to them. Nobody laughed. Blake Donovan held his Glock at his side and stared at the paper. He looked at his own target, 25 meters, 14 rounds, scattered across the scoring zone, 2 in the white, 1 complete miss. He looked back at what Webb was holding. He said nothing. Duvall walked to where Cassidy was standing and looked at her face for a long moment. He saw no pride in it, no satisfaction. She looked like someone who had done what she came to do and was waiting for whatever came next. Your grandfather, he said. What did he do for a living? He was a farmer, Sergeant. We had land in Montana. Before the farm. She paused. Small, but Duvall noticed it. He was in the Army, she said. He served for a long time. Duvall turned to Sergeant First Class Rivera, who ran the Advanced Marksmanship program and had appeared at the edge of the range without anyone calling him. Word moved fast in a training facility when something unusual was happening. Set the target at 200, Duvall said. Rivera looked at him. That's not scheduled, Breck. I know. Set it anyway. At 200 meters, the physics change. Bullet drop becomes a variable that requires anticipation. Wind, barely perceptible at close range, asserts itself. The margin for error compresses. A shooter who looks adequate at 100 meters can come apart entirely at 200. Duvall watched Cassidy at the firing line and saw her do something he had not expected. Before she raised the rifle, she looked at the grass along the far edge of the range. Then she looked at a thin thread of dust moving along the gravel berm to the northeast. She tilted her head very slightly, reading something in the air that had no numerical value. She was reading the wind without instruments, without data, with her eyes and her accumulated knowledge, and whatever had been deposited inside her over years of mornings, she was never going to forget. She fired 5 rounds. The grouping at 200 meters was not as tight as the first. Physics would not allow it. But it was centered, disciplined, all rounds within the scoring zone, a spread that any trained marksman would have accepted on a good day with preparation. Rivera walked to the spotting scope, adjusted the focus, and looked for a long time. He turned around and looked at Duval with an expression that asked a question without needing words. 300, Duval said. Rivera nodded. 300 meters, the practical outer boundary of an M4 carbine under range conditions. Beyond that, the weapon's ballistics become unpredictable enough that accuracy depends more on fortune than skill. At 300 meters, you are asking a bullet to travel the length of 3 football fields and strike a target the size of a dinner plate. Most of the recruits had stopped pretending to prepare for their own exercises. Marcus Webb stood with his arms folded. He had spent 16 years hunting deer and elk and turkey in eastern Tennessee. He had made shots in bad light, in cold rain at distances that required patience and knowledge. He had been around firearms and skilled shooters his entire life. He had never seen anything like this. Cassidy, at 300 meters, stood at the firing line for 4 minutes before she fired. 4 minutes of stillness. 4 minutes of reading, adjusting, waiting. Not the stillness of paralysis. The stillness of someone who has learned that the solution arrives when you stop trying to force it. 5 shots. When the target came back, every round had landed within a handspan of center. The flag at the facility's entrance was the only sound on the range. Canvas moving in the wind. Sergeant Martinez, who ran advanced marksmanship, had arrived at the range during the 300-meter exercise. No one had called him. Word had moved through a look, a gesture, someone leaning into an office doorway and saying 2 words worth saying. He studied the return target the way a craftsman examines another craftsman's work. Not with envy, with a quiet recognition that expresses itself as silence. Harlow, he said, looking at the roster card in his hand. How long have you been shooting? Since I was 8, Sergeant. Daily practice, nearly, sir, until I left for college. He looked at the target again, then at Duval. They had been doing this long enough to communicate without needing language. What passed between them in that moment was simple. This level of skill does not emerge from a farm in Montana without someone investing years of deliberate, sophisticated instruction. Someone who understood precision at a level that belonged to a very specific world. A world that most people never saw, and that most people who had seen it did not discuss. Captain Elliot Crane arrived at the range at 10:17. He was 56 years old with white hair that had come early and given him an authority he had learned to use. 28 years of service. 4 years at Fort Carson as a senior training officer overseeing program structure and performance standards across all cycles. He was good at his job. He was also carrying something that had nothing to do with his job, something he had been carrying for a long time, the way a man carries a stone in his chest that he has decided to live around rather than remove. He walked onto the range with measured pace, projecting calm over whatever his mind was doing beneath it. He looked at the targets. He looked at Cassidy. He asked for her file, which Duval provided. He read through it with a face that showed nothing. When he reached the line listing her home state and next of kin information, his hand stopped moving. Not dramatically, a half-second stillness, the kind that only registers if you are paying close attention. Duval was paying close attention. Crane returned the file and began asking questions in the tone of routine inquiry. Where she was from, her background, her grandfather's name. Roland Harlow, Cassidy said. He had land outside Billings. Crane nodded as though this were an ordinary answer to an ordinary question. And before the farm, he was in the Army, sir. He didn't talk about his service much. He said he served for a long time and that was enough. Crane studied her face for a moment, not the look of a man assessing a recruit, but something older than that, something that had been waiting in him for a long time and had just been handed an unexpected occasion to surface. He asked 2 more questions, received 2 unremarkable answers, and told Cassidy to continue with her schedule. He walked off the range without looking back. General Audra Finch's vehicle arrived at the main training facility at 11:45 without prior notice. She was 58 years old with posture that announced rank before the insignia confirmed it. 32 years of service across 3 continents. For the past 10 years, alongside her operational responsibilities, she had been doing something that few officers at her level did with their private time research. Specifically, she had spent a decade assembling the history of a unit whose records had been lock-scattered and in some cases deliberately eliminated. A unit that had operated from the mid-1960s through the mid-1970s under a classification level so high that most people who had ever heard its name had heard it only as a rumor in a corridor from someone who immediately changed the subject. Black Talon. She had read the recently declassified fragment. She had noted the call sign. She had cross-referenced it against the partial personnel data that survived, and she had followed that thread until it led her here to a training report filed that morning by a Sergeant Breck Duval at Fort Carson, describing an anomalous performance by a 22-year-old recruit named Cassidy Harlow. The surname. That was what had caught her. She walked onto the range and the effect was immediate. Back straightened. The ambient noise of the facility gathered itself into attention. General on deck. Finch waved it off. Carry on. She found Duval and asked him to describe what had happened that morning. He did concisely and without ornamentation the way a good sergeant reports just the facts in sequence, with no editorializing. She listened to all of it. Then she asked to see Cassidy shoot. 3 targets were set at 100, 200, and 300 meters. Cassidy was told to engage each with 5 rounds when ready. Finch stood behind the firing line with her arms folded and her face empty of expression. She had seen a great many things in 3 decades of military service. She watched Cassidy fire 15 rounds across 3 distances. She listened to the rhythm of the sequence, the spacing of the shots, the length of the pauses between them, the unhurried deliberateness of the whole performance. She was looking for something specific. She found it. When the final target came back, Finch walked to the spotting scope and looked through it for 90 seconds. Then she straightened and turned toward Cassidy. Harlow, I want to ask you about your grandfather. Cassidy came to attention. Yes, ma'am, he served in the Army. Yes, ma'am, describe him for me. Not his service. Him, what he looked like. What you remember. Cassidy considered this. He was average height, dark hair when he was young gray by the time I knew him well. He had a scar on his right forearm from a piece of farm equipment. He was quiet, the quietest person I've ever known. Did he have any distinguishing marks, tattoos, one Cassidy said. On his left shoulder, a bird wing spread, talons open. He never explained it. When I asked, he said it was from his Army days and didn't say anything else after that. Finch reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out her phone. She navigated to an image from a scanned archival document, grainy age the product of years of searching through systems that had not been designed to give up what was inside them. She turned the phone around and held it in front of Cassidy. Did it look like this? The image showed a bird rendered in black ink. Wings fully extended, each primary feather sharply defined. Talons spread and curved. A raptor at the instant before impact, not resting, not fleeing. Striking. Cassidy looked at the image. Something shifted in her face, the small but unmistakable expression of a person who has just seen something familiar surface in a context that makes no sense, the way a photograph from your own childhood might appear inside a stranger's house. Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly it. Finch lowered the phone. She looked around at the range, the recruits in their positions. Duval and Martinez watching Blake Donovan standing to the left with an expression that had hardened into something deliberate. She raised her voice just enough to carry. Everyone back to scheduled activities. This demonstration is concluded. The range began to clear. Finch stepped close to Cassidy, close enough that what she said next was for Cassidy alone. 2 words. Black Talon. Cassidy looked at her. The name was unfamiliar. It carried no association, no history. But something in the weight of those 2 words, the care with which Finch said them, the way her voice went quiet and precise, told Cassidy that they meant a great deal to someone and that she was standing on the edge of understanding why. I don't know what that is, ma'am. I know, Finch said. Come with me. The office they used was small and functional, a metal desk, 2 chairs, a window, looking out over the parade ground. Finch sent her aide out and closed the door. She told Cassidy in clear and measured language what Black Talon was. A classified special operations unit. Small teams, 2 to 4 men. Missions at the highest classification level, requiring absolute operational secrecy. Long-range reconnaissance. Precision engagement of high-value targets in conditions that conventional forces could not enter. Their success rate in the partial records that existed was unlike anything in the documented history of American special operations. Then she said that the tattoo on Cassidy's grandfather's shoulder was the emblem of that unit, worn only by confirmed members. That a man named Roland Harlow, callsign Phantom, appeared in the surviving records as one of its most decorated members. Cassidy sat very still. The quiet in the room had changed. It was no longer the quiet of an empty office. It was wait. Finch said that she needed Cassidy to think back over everything she could remember, every conversation, every story told or withheld, every detail that might fill in what the records alone could not say. Cassidy looked at the window. She thought about the man who had woken her before dawn on winter mornings to practice in the cold, who had taught her to read wind direction by watching the movement of grass at varying distances, who had told her more than once that the most important part of any shot was everything that happened before you pulled the trigger. She thought about his silence regarding his service. Not bitter silence, not the silence of shame. Something else, the silence of a room with a closed door that a man has decided not to open for reasons he has determined are sufficient. She thought about the bird on his left shoulder, the way he would pull his shirt back on quickly after working outside in summer if he noticed her looking. She had always assumed he was embarrassed by it. She was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Cassidy walked back across the training facility toward the barracks, the afternoon light had flattened to gray. The recruits, still visible in the distance, moved through their exercises with no awareness of what had just occurred in that small office. The world looked the same, but her understanding of it had shifted the way ground shifts in an earthquake, not dramatically, just enough to make you aware that what you are standing on can move. She was almost to the barracks when she passed the gap between the vehicle maintenance shed and the fuel storage building, a narrow passage 10 feet wide, concrete walls on both sides. She would not have noticed it if she hadn't heard a voice, low, controlled, precise. A man accustomed to speaking at a register that does not carry. She stopped. She recognized the voice after 2 words. Captain Crane. She caught only fragments through the confined space. Her own name clearly, the word managed. And then one sentence, complete and unmistakable. Harlow's granddaughter is here. This needs to be managed before Stahl gets involved. A pause. The other voice on the line inaudible. Then Crane again, lower. I know how long it's been. That doesn't change what's at stake. A door opened somewhere behind her. She walked. She did not stop until she was inside the barracks, and even then she stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the parade ground, at the flag moving in the cold wind off the mountains. She did not know who Stahl was. She did not know what Crane meant by managed. She did not know what was at stake, or for whom or why her grandfather's name, the name of a quiet man from Montana who grew vegetables and repaired fences and never raised his voice, was the kind of name that could make a captain's voice go cold 48 years after the fact. But she knew this. Something had been set in motion that morning. And it had begun not with anything she had done, but with a single bullet hole in a paper target at 100 meters. And whatever her grandfather had built into her hands, her lungs, and her patience over 10 years of mornings in the Montana cold. Building 47 did not look like a place where secrets were kept. That was the point. It sat at the southeastern edge of Fort Carson's administrative campus, separated from the main cluster of offices by a stretch of gravel and drought-tolerant shrubs that nobody had planted for appearance. Concrete blocks, single-story, narrow windows, a keypad entry indistinguishable from a dozen other restricted facilities on the base. No sign, just a number stenciled above the door in regulation black paint. Cassidy arrived at 800 hours. A guard checked her identification and directed her up a flight of stairs to a conference room on the 2nd floor. The room held a rectangular table, 4 chairs, a wall-mounted screen, and 2 people. General Finch was standing near the window. The second person was seated. He was 69 years old, and he carried those years in the way men do when they have spent most of them doing hard things in difficult places, not worn down, but settled the way old timber settles into the structure it was built to support. White hair, hands resting flat on the table, crossed with the fine scarring that accumulates over decades of field work. No uniform. A gray sport coat, white shirt, no tie. He looked like someone's grandfather. He was Colonel Warren Stahl, retired. 23 years of service, the last 8 with a unit whose name appeared in no official directory and whose operations remained, with a handful of recent exceptions, beyond the reach of any Freedom of Information request ever filed. He looked at Cassidy when she entered, and something in his face changed, not dramatically. Recognition becoming something heavier. Grief, perhaps, or the relative of grief that forms when a debt has been carried too long. Sit down, he said. She sat. He opened a folder and pushed it toward her. The first document was a personnel record, the header marked DE classified in red with the date 3 months prior. The name at the top was Roland James Harlow. Service number, and beneath that a designation Cassidy had never seen: Black Talon Tier 1 Operational Unit, callsign Phantom. She looked at the photograph stapled to the upper right corner. Her grandfather at approximately 30 years old. The same jaw, the same stillness in the eyes. He was in uniform, and he was not smiling, and he looked exactly like himself, like the man who had stood at the kitchen window on winter mornings, drinking his coffee, in the dark before sunrise, looking at nothing in particular, and seeing something she had never been able to follow. She had always believed that was simply who he was. She was beginning to understand that who he was had been built from things she was only now being allowed to see. Stahl did not let her stay with the photograph. He had done this before, not often, but enough to know that dwelling on the personal too early made everything harder. He turned the page. Your grandfather joined the Army in 1957, he said, 22 years old. Served a standard infantry tour, demonstrated ability that exceeded his unit's expectations, and was recruited into a specialized program in 1965, assigned to Black Talon in 1966. He spoke from memory rather than from the page. The unit operated in small teams, 2 to 4 men. Missions classified at the highest level, not from shame, but because operational secrecy was the condition for the work to function at all. If a team's presence was confirmed, the mission was already failed. They went in without support structures, without extraction guarantees. They worked alone in the field for as long as the mission required, and they got out or they didn't. Cassidy listened without speaking. Your grandfather was the finest long-range shooter I have personally known, Stahl continued, and I have known a great many. He had what I can only describe as a physical understanding of the relationship between a projectile and its environment. He didn't calculate it, he felt it. Wind elevation, temperature, distance. He read all of it simultaneously the way a trained musician reads a full score. He paused. In November of 1971, he said your grandfather's team was assigned a mission. The unit commander assessed at 40% probability of success. 4 men, deep into hostile territory without air support or communication backup. The target was a coordinator responsible for a series of strikes that had resulted in significant American casualties. He slid a map across the table. Old hand-drawn pencil notations faded to the color of old grass. The target was here, he said, placing one finger on a marked position. Your grandfather's team reached this ridge. The confirmed distance between the shooter and the target was 847 meters. He let that number rest. The equipment available in 1971 was not what we have today. No laser rangefinder, no computerized ballistics program, no digital wind measurement. He used a scope that would be considered obsolete within 5 years of that mission. He read the range by eye and by training and by whatever a decade of preparation had built into him. He made the shot. Cassidy looked at the line drawn on the map between 2 pencil-marked points, 847 meters of open air through which a bullet had traveled and arrived exactly where it was aimed. She thought about 300 meters on the range that morning, about how long she had stood at the firing line, about her grandfather's voice calm and close, the voice she still heard on cold mornings in her right ear, breathe out halfway and wait for your body to stop moving. The body always stops if you give it time enough. She said nothing. After the shot, Stahl continued the team's position was compromised. They had to move. They were pursued by a force significantly larger than their own. 3 members reached a secondary extraction corridor. Your grandfather stayed behind. A pause. He stayed to cover them. For 3 days, he held a series of positions in terrain he had never operated in without resupply, with a finite number of rounds using the landscape and his own judgment to slow a pursuit force many times his size. On the 3rd day, his team reached safety. On the 4th day, he reached a tertiary extraction point, severely wounded, having survived on water collected from his environment. 2 months in a military hospital. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. Stahl reached into the folder and produced a second document. Heavy, formal, bearing the embossed seal. Cassidy recognized the eagle, the shield, the arrows, and the olive branch. The citation was classified, he said, awarded in a private ceremony attended by 4 people. Your grandfather received the medal, thanked the officers who presented it, and asked that no record of the ceremony be made public. He said he didn't want the attention. He meant it. Cassidy looked at the citation. Her grandfather's name in the formal language of official recognition language, cold and precise in the way official language always is when it attempts to describe something that was anything but. She thought about the man who had grown tomatoes behind the barn and listened to ball games on a radio older than she was, who had taught her to change a tire and split wood and read the weather by the color of the western sky, who had stood at the end of the shooting range he built himself and watched her fire until her shoulder ached and said every single time again. That man had held a position alone for 3 days so his team could live. She pressed her lips together. I was there, Cassidy Stahl said. I was the youngest member of that team, 21 years old. I would not have reached the extraction corridor without Roland's decision to stay behind. I have thought about that decision every day for 48 years. He folded his hands. I owe him a debt I have never been able to repay. This is the closest I have come to trying. He looked at her steadily across the table. General Finch has told me what happened on the range yesterday. I'm here to offer you something. The Special Operations Sniper Program. 2 years, a 90% washout rate, and that figure is not an exaggeration. But you carry a foundation that most candidates spend those 2 years trying to build from the ground up. He looked at her steadily. Your grandfather gave you that foundation. Whether he intended to prepare you for this specifically, I cannot say with certainty. I suspect he had his reasons. He always did. Cassidy looked at the citation on the table, at her grandfather's name in formal print. She thought about the bird on his shoulder and the 2 words spoken in a near whisper at the edge of a training range. Yes, she said. I'll go, Stahl nodded. Report to the transfer office this afternoon. You'll be at the Colorado facility by 1800. He stood and Cassidy stood with him, and they shook hands across the table, the handshake of two people who have just agreed to something that matters. His grip was dry and steady, the grip of a man with nothing left to prove. At the door, she stopped. He was looking at the folder still on the table. Not reading it, just looking at it. He was a good man, Stahl said. The best I knew. Whatever you're about to learn will be difficult. Some of it hard to hear, but none of it changes what he was. She nodded. She left. She would understand what he meant by that before long. The training facility west of Colorado Springs occupied a compound of low modern buildings set into high-altitude pine forest. The air at 8,000 feet carried cold resin and thinness, and the light through the trees in the morning hours came in at an angle that made the ground look silver. The altitude was not incidental to the location. It was the first test. Cassidy arrived in the early evening and was shown to a dormitory room. 2 narrow beds, 2 metal lockers, a window facing the northern tree line. The other bed's owner had arranged her belongings with a precision that described her personality before a word was spoken. That person arrived 20 minutes later. Tessa Morrow was 24 with a runner's build and a direct, unsentimental way of looking at people that was not unfriendly, simply honest. 6 months in the program. She shook Cassidy's hand and sat back on her bed and said without preamble, the first month is the worst. After that, it's just hard. Then she said, your name is Harlow. Yes, Roland Harlow was your grandfather. Cassidy looked at her. My father grew up knowing about Black Talon. Tessa said because his father served in it. A different team, same unit. He didn't speak much about specifics. The unit operated with a compartmentalized knowledge, each team knowing only what was necessary. But he knew the call sign Phantom. He said everyone in the unit knew it. It was the kind of name that meant something, even among men who went out of their way not to be impressed by anything. What did he say about him, Cassidy asked. That he was the best, Tessa said, and that he was the kind of man who didn't need anyone to know it. Outside wind moved through the upper branches of the pine trees in a sound like distant water. The letter arrived on the 4th morning. It came through the base mail system, routed from the administrative office at Fort Carson, a plain white envelope with Cassidy's name written by hand. She recognized the handwriting before she consciously understood that she recognized it. The letter slightly forward-leaning, the H in Harlow with its characteristic long second leg, her grandfather's hand. She sat on her bed and held the envelope before opening it. Inside were 3 folded pages. The letter was dated September 2013, 2 years before Roland Harlow died when Cassidy was 16. She read it once quickly, the way you read something when your hands are not quite steady, and then she read it again slowly. He had known. Not the specific details. He could not have known which morning, which range, which general would appear. But he had known the shape of what would happen. He understood how certain records stay buried until they no longer can. How certain names carry weight that outlasts the men who carry them. How the past surfaces when it is ready, and not a moment before. He had written the letter for that moment. The first 2 pages were instruction, a detailed description of reading crosswind at distances beyond 500 meters using natural indicators alone, grass lean, dust, drift, smoke rise, the movement of water, if any was visible. Step by step in the precise and patient language he had always used when teaching her something that mattered. Practical, careful, entirely like him. The last half of the 3rd page was different. She read it a 3rd time. He wrote, there will be people who try to tell you that what I did, what I was, is something to be explained away or hidden. They are carrying old pain and looking for somewhere to put it down. That is not your burden to carry for them. He wrote, Phantom was not a name I chose. It was a name I earned by doing necessary work in a way that left no trace. I was proud of that. I remain proud of it. But pride is a quiet thing. It does not require an audience. He wrote, I taught you to shoot because you had the capacity for it. I taught you patience and stillness and how to wait for the right moment because those things matter everywhere, not only at the end of a rifle. If what I gave you has brought you somewhere important, I am glad. If it has brought you somewhere difficult, I am equally glad. Those two places are usually the same place. The last line read, be better than I was, not at the shooting, at everything else. She sat with the letter until the morning light through the window had moved from gray to pale gold. Then she folded it carefully, returned it to its envelope, and placed it inside the cover of a notebook in her top drawer. She went to training. Blake Donovan arrived at the facility at the end of the second week. He had transferred through administrative channels that most recruits did not have access to, a lateral reassignment process quickly and quietly, the kind that happens when a phone call reaches the right desk. His father's company held contracts with 3 separate defense agencies. These things were not unrelated. He was assigned to a different dormitory, but the same training rotation. He did not acknowledge Cassidy when they passed the first morning. That was fine. What was not fine, what she noted and filed without yet having an explanation for, was the quality of his hostility when it did emerge. It was not the ordinary friction of a competitive man towards someone who had bested him on a training field. That variety was transparent and burned itself out. This was more specific. It had the texture of something decided before he arrived. 3 weeks and Cassidy failed her first major evaluation. The assessment was called Decision Under Pressure. A simulated field scenario with incomplete information, a tightening time constraint, 2 competing objectives and variables introduced at intervals designed to systematically invalidate whatever plan the candidate had built. The purpose was not to see whether the candidate made the correct decision. The purpose was to see whether the candidate could make any decision at all when everything familiar stopped being true. Cassidy froze. Not physically she moved, she spoke, she engaged with the scenario. But the decisions she made were not her own. They were her best reconstruction of what she believed her grandfather would have done, filtered through incomplete knowledge of a man she was only beginning to understand. She was not operating from judgment. She was trying to borrow his. His was not available. The evaluator called time. She stood at the edge of the exercise area and knew before a word was said that she had failed. Master Sergeant Laurel Oakes found her afterward, compact, deliberate, 44 years old, with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years in environments where waste has consequences. 7 years running the psychological preparation component of this program. She had seen every variety of failure this training environment produced. She sat beside Cassidy on a bench outside the assessment building. You were running a ghost operation up there, she said. Cassidy looked at her. Every decision point you reached back for a reference. You were asking yourself what Roland Harlow would do instead of determining what Cassidy Harlow should do. The problem is the reference is gone, and the deeper problem is that you are not him. She said it without cruelty. He built his judgment over 20 years of field experience. You cannot inherit it. You can inherit the foundation, and you have, which is why you're here, and not at a standard infantry billet. But the structure above the foundation must be yours, built by you in real time under pressure, designed to prevent clear thinking. That is the entire program. Cassidy said, I understand that. Oakes said, you understand it in your head. You don't understand it yet in the place where decisions actually get made. That takes longer. The question is whether you'll give yourself the time or keep reaching for something that can't help you anymore. She stood. Get back to the range. You have a long-range session in 40 minutes. Start from what you already know and build from there. Cassidy went to the range. She shot well. She always shot well. That was not the problem, and she understood now that it never had been. The shooting was the inheritance. The judgment, the capacity to function clearly when everything prepared for had stopped being true, that was what remained to be built. She started building it. The story Tessa told came in pieces across 4 evenings in the dormitory in the space between lights out and sleep. Tessa's grandfather had not spoken directly about the incident. He had spoken around it the way men of that generation spoke around things that cost too much references, without context, names, without explanation, a particular way of going still when certain years came up. Tessa's father had spent his adult life assembling the fragments. The incident was in 1973, a joint operation. 2 black Talon teams coordinating for the first time in the unit's history, an unusual configuration required by an unusually scaled objective. The mission demanded equipment the teams had not used before, sourced through a procurement channel established 18 months earlier. The contract had been awarded to a supplier called Donovan Armaments. The equipment failed. 2 members of the second team died as a direct result, not in combat from equipment failure, at the moment when the equipment's function was the difference between living and not. The investigation that followed was conducted under the same classification level as the unit itself. The conclusions were never published, never reviewed externally, never subject to the ordinary processes of accountability that applied to any other military incident. The finding attributed the failure to operational error on the part of the team. Black Talon was blamed. Donovan Armaments was not. Tessa said this flatly, the flatness of a person who has lived with an injustice long enough to stop expecting it to feel different than it does. Roland Harlow knew the truth, she said. He had examined the failed equipment himself. He understood exactly what had caused the failure and was prepared to say so publicly. He chose not to. Cassidy looked at her. Why? Tessa was quiet. Because Warren Stahl was the procurement officer who signed for the Donovan contract. He was 21 years old and new to the role. He had followed procedure correctly. The failure was in the equipment, not the process, but the paperwork carried his name. A full investigation following the evidence where it actually led would have ended Stahl's career and likely resulted in charges that would have defined the rest of his life. Another pause. Your grandfather decided that losing Stahl, the one member of that team who had come home with his judgment and his capacity intact, the one person positioned to do something of genuine value with his remaining years, was a worse outcome than letting the official record stand as written. He protected Stahl, Cassidy said, with 50 years of silence. Yes. She thought about the letter in her drawer. The last line, be better than I was, not at the shooting, at everything else. She understood now what he had been confessing. And Crane, she said, his brother. Tessa nodded. His older brother was one of the two men who died in 1973. Crane had grown up with the official record as his truth. He had spent his career carrying that truth quietly and privately, and with an intensity that had given it the permanence of bone. He had built his grief around the name Phantom, around Roland Harlow. And when Roland's granddaughter walked onto a training range and made herself impossible to ignore the grief, and whatever it had become over 50 years had found a new direction. Cassidy lay back on her bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about what her grandfather had chosen and why, and whether she would have chosen differently. She found she could not answer that with any honesty. She was not 40 years old with the weight of a team's survival in her hands. She was 22, and she was here, and the choice had already been made by someone who no longer could speak for it. What she knew was this: he had carried it. He had never asked anyone to understand it or commend him for it, or carry any portion of it alongside him. He had simply continued to be the person he had decided to be. She thought she understood for the first time what the black bird with the open talons had actually meant. Not aggression, not power. Something more precise, the willingness to strike when striking was necessary, and the willingness afterward to be still. To let the moment pass without requiring anything back from it. Precision, then silence. That was the emblem. That was the man. The 72-hour survival evaluation began on a Thursday morning in late October. 2 candidates. Designated insertion point, minimal equipment, a topographic map, a compass, a list of objectives to complete before reaching extraction, food provisions calibrated to discomfort, communication restricted to a single emergency transponder whose activation constituted automatic failure. Cassidy's partner was a candidate named Durfield Steady, experienced 3 years as a combat medic before the program. His fieldcraft was clean and his communication was clear. They completed the first 2 objectives ahead of schedule. On the second morning, Cassidy opened her map case. She read through the topography, carefully cross-referencing against the terrain around her. The map was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not so wrong that a cursory check would reveal it. Wrong in the precise, careful way that something is wrong when someone who knows what they are doing has altered it with intent. A trail marker transposed. An elevation contour that did not correspond to the actual ground. Small enough to appear like a printing error. Significant enough to redirect 2 people deep into the wrong terrain after dark. She identified the discrepancy by the time they had traveled 2 kilometers past a checkpoint that should have been marked and wasn't. She rebuilt the route from the terrain itself, slope, angle, drainage channels, horizon features. No map, no data, just the land and what she knew about how to read it. It added 6 hours to the extraction. They arrived 6 hours and 40 minutes past the required completion time. The evaluator was waiting. So was Captain Crane. He delivered the assessment without satisfaction, which was worse than if he had shown any. Professional. Measured. He cited the completion time, the program's standards, the formal language of evaluation. He stated that Harlow had failed to meet the required parameters. He recommended removal from the program. Cassidy stood in the gray morning air and looked at him. She did not argue. She did not explain. She said, "I'd like to request a formal review, sir." Crane said, "That's your right." He turned and walked to the vehicle. Cassidy watched his shoulders, the set of them, the tightness of a man who has been carrying a fixed weight for so long that the carrying has become his posture. She thought he has spent 50 years with his brother's death. She thought he blamed the wrong man. She thought, that is not something I can prove today, but I will. Durfield came to stand beside her. After a moment, he said the map was off by about 300 meters at the Whitmore Junction. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "I know what I saw out there. Whatever the official record says, I know what I saw." She looked at him. She didn't say thank you. Something passed between them that was more durable than gratitude, the specific and wordless solidarity of people who have been in the same hard place and emerged from it, knowing exactly what happened, regardless of what anyone else intended to write down. The mountains above the facility were taking on the gray of approaching snow. Cassidy looked at them for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the compound, and her stride was the same stride she had used crossing the parade ground at Fort Carson on the first morning, unhurried, even carrying something forward without letting it show on the outside. Her grandfather's stride. She was still learning what to do with it, but she was learning. The formal review request was filed at 0800 on a Friday. Cassidy submitted it in writing using the standard form for contested evaluations, citing the specific regulation that entitled any candidate to procedural review when new evidence bore a reasonable relationship to the outcome. She described the altered map clearly, the transposed trail marker, the elevation discrepancy at the Whitmore Junction, the systematic nature of the errors, the terrain recalculation she had performed without navigational support. She signed it. She submitted it. She went to the range and spent 90 minutes practicing. The shooting had not changed. Everything else was in motion, her understanding of her family, the structure of her days, the ground beneath her footing. But at the firing line, the world was simple. She knew what to do. Her grandfather had given her that. No one could take it back. Over the weekend, two things happened. Warren Stahl drove from Virginia to Colorado with a box in the back of his car. The box contained maintenance logs, procurement records from 1973, and a set of handwritten field notes he had made during the joint operation documents he had kept for 48 years in a way that was not preservation but inability to discard. He transferred the contents into the program's official review record with Finch's assistance. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The second thing was Blake Donovan. On Sunday afternoon, during a scheduled equipment maintenance session, Donovan was observed by two candidates, Durfield and a trainee named Haynes, in the armory cage where evaluation rifles were stored. He was at the rack assigned to Cassidy's equipment. He had a tool in his hand that did not belong in an armory during routine maintenance. Durfield took out his phone. He recorded for 40 seconds. Then he walked to the duty sergeant's office, placed the phone on the desk and said, "You need to watch this." Donovan was removed from training activities that evening, pending formal investigation under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charge was interference with government property. His father's phone calls were not returned. Cassidy learned about it from Oakes, who delivered the information with the same economy she applied to everything. "You need to know." Then she told her. Then she left. Cassidy sat for a time in the empty assessment room. She thought about the altered map and the sabotaged rifle and the phone call overheard between two concrete walls. She thought about a plan running long enough to become reflex, the way protection and aggression become indistinguishable when maintained across decades. Blake Donovan had likely not known the full shape of what his family was protecting. He had been aimed, not informed. That made it worse in a way. She thought about her grandfather's letter, the line about old Payne looking for somewhere to go. She sat with that until the room went dark. Then she went to dinner. On Saturday evening, Warren Stahl knocked on the door of Captain Crane's quarters. Crane opened the door and let him in without speaking. He had been expecting something, though not necessarily this. Stahl set the box on the table. He did not sit down. He placed the documents in front of Crane one by one: maintenance logs, procurement records, field notes, the chain of decisions that had led from a supplier's contract to 2 men's deaths to 5 decades of misdirected grief. He said nothing while he did it. He let the documents speak. Crane read for 2 hours. Stahl sat across the table and waited. When Crane set the last page down, he did not look up immediately. He looked at his hands on the table. The hands of a man who has just seen the foundation of something he built his life around turn out to be constructed from material that was never what it claimed to be. He said, "How long have you known?" "Since the beginning," Stahl said. Crane looked at him. He said in Harlow. "From the day it happened," Stahl said. The room held silence. Crane said, "Why didn't he?" He stopped himself. He already knew why. The answer was sitting in the room with him in the procurement records, bearing Stahl's signature, in the youth of the man across the table at that time, in the arithmetic of a decision made under pressure that Roland Harlow had carried forward without complaint or credit for 48 years. Crane sat with it until the room went dark. He did not sleep. In the morning, he called his attorney and then General Finch's office. The review hearing convened in Building 47 at 900 hours on Monday. The room was the same room where Cassidy had first looked at her grandfather's service photograph, but the configuration had changed. General Finch at the head of the table, Stahl to her right. Captain Crane across from Cassidy, upright and controlled, carrying his interior weight with composure that had cost him considerably. Finch stated the purpose, summarized the contested evaluation, noted the existence of new evidence. She said the conclusion would be binding. She looked at Crane. "Captain, do you have anything to add to your filed assessment?" Crane said. "Yes, ma'am." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. "The map used in the Harlow-Durfield evaluation was modified," he said. "The modifications were deliberate and systematic. They were designed to produce a result that would justify removal from the program." Finch said nothing. The room held the sentence. "I authorized the modification," Crane said. He continued without pause, as though having started, he needed to complete it before the impulse failed. "I maintained contact with members of the Donovan family for the past 14 months. The relationship began as a professional one. It became something else. I was provided with information about the Harlow candidate's enrollment. I was encouraged to ensure her progression was unsuccessful." He looked at his hands on the table. "I allowed myself to be encouraged," he said, "because I carried my own reasons for wanting that outcome." He looked up. "I believed for 50 years that members of Black Talon were responsible for the death of my brother. The official records supported that belief. I built a considerable portion of my professional life around it. When an opportunity arose to act on it indirectly through a candidate who bore the name, I took it." He paused. "The documents Colonel Stahl has submitted change what I understand to be true about the 1973 incident. The failure that killed my brother was an equipment failure. The equipment came through a Donovan contract. The finding attributing the failure to operational error was incorrect. There is strong and consistent evidence that the incorrect finding was engineered by the Donovan family's legal representation at the time." He looked directly at Cassidy across the table for the first time in the hearing. "Roland Harlow knew the truth of it," he said. "He chose silence. For most of my life, I did not know why. I understand why now." He stopped. "That is all I have to add." Cassidy looked at him across the table. She had imagined a version of this moment, not with precise detail, but in the general way you imagine the moment when something hidden finally becomes visible, when a long injustice achieves the shape of a specific and nameable thing. She had expected it to feel clarifying, decisive. It felt like looking at a man who had spent 50 years navigating by a broken compass. She thought about him carrying his brother's death through decades of service. Through every morning he put on his uniform in rooms where no one knew what he was carrying. She thought about that loneliness, the particular and unshared weight of grieving in the wrong direction for half a century. She did not forgive him in that room on that morning. Forgiveness was a different and longer process, and it was not required of her here. But something moved in her chest that was neither anger nor pity, nor entirely separate from either. She looked at General Finch. Finch closed her notepad. "The evaluation outcome is overturned," she said. "Candidate Harlow remains in the program in full standing. Captain Crane, you are relieved of your duties pending a full investigation. I strongly recommend your cooperation with that process." She paused. "This hearing is concluded." Crane stood. He had brought nothing to the table, so he gathered nothing. At the door, he stopped and turned back. He did not look at Finch. He did not look at Stahl. He looked at Cassidy. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a better man than I gave him credit for a very long time." He left. The door closed without sound. The final assessment of the program's second year arrived without announcement on a Thursday morning in late November. The lack of warning was standard. Candidates knew a terminal assessment was coming. Not knowing when was itself part of what was being evaluated, the ability to perform without the psychological preparation of a scheduled event was precisely what the program had spent 2 years building. At 5:40 in the morning, Oakes knocked on the dormitory door. "Range, 20 minutes. Bring your kit." The snow had come down overnight, and the range at dawn was white and unmarked, the kind of clean that exists only before footsteps. The range lights cut pale circles in the gray dark. Instructors stood along the line. General Finch was present. Warren Stahl stood slightly apart from the group, hands in the pockets of his coat, His face turned toward the tree line. The target was at 600 meters. Terminal assessment. 5 rounds. No data card, no support. 1 attempt. There was also, Oakes informed her, an additional component requested by General Finch. A second target at an undisclosed distance revealed after the first sequence. 1 round. Range and conditions to be calculated from the firing line alone. Cassidy looked at Finch. Finch said nothing. Cassidy took her position. The 600-meter sequence. She settled into her stance. The snow beneath her front foot was compressed and firm. Beneath her rear foot, slightly softer, creating a small grade that she corrected by shifting her weight 2 degrees forward. She looked downrange. The air was cold and motionless. The snow had stopped falling within the past hour, and the light was changing in the east, the darkness thinning toward a color that was neither blue nor gray. The target at 600 meters was a dark shape against the pale field. She breathed in, breathed out halfway, pulled the trigger. The shot broke and she reset and knew immediately she had pulled it. Not a dramatic error, a quarter inch of premature movement in the trigger finger, the kind that happens when the desire to perform overrides the deeper discipline that good shooting requires. The round struck the target. It was within the scoring zone. By the standards of most ranges, it was an acceptable shot. By the standards of this program, and by the standards she had inherited, it was wrong. She knew it. Oakes knew it. The instructors along the line knew it. Stahl, watching from behind her, knew it. She held still. The snow on the ground, the pale and growing light, the mountains showing their dark shapes through the thinning morning dark. She heard her grandfather's voice. Not the letter earlier than that. The range behind the barn, frost on the ground and her breath visible in the cold air. Borrow time from the target, not from yourself. She breathed again. She reset. She waited. She let her body find the actual stillness. Not the forced stillness of effort, but the arrived stillness that comes when you stop trying and simply stop. The body settling like sediment, the mind going quiet at the center. The second shot broke clean. So did the third, the fourth, the fifth. When the target came back, 4 of the 5 rounds had produced a grouping that any marksman would have kept. The first was outside a deviation that told the sequence's story plainly, 1 error caught, corrected, not repeated. Oakes made no comment. Stahl looked at the target for a long time. Then Finch stepped forward. She told Cassidy to look downrange. The second target had been placed while she completed the first sequence. It stood at the far end of the range at a distance she could not yet determine. Calculate your own range, Finch said. No assistance. Cassidy looked at the target. She read the compression of terrain features with distance, the relative dimensions of the frame against the landscape behind it. She looked at snow beginning to drift imperceptibly along the gravel berm to the northeast. She looked at the tree line at the facility's eastern edge and the slight lean of the upper branches in a wind that had not yet reached the range surface. She made 2 scope adjustments. Raised the rifle again. She waited. Stahl, standing behind her at the edge of the line, had not moved. This was the test inside the test, not the shot itself the 4 minutes before it. The reading and the waiting and the willingness to take whatever time the problem required, regardless of audience, regardless of what was at stake. To refuse the urgency that watching generates. To trust the preparation over the pressure. Her grandfather at 847 meters. No rangefinder, no data. A mission's outcome, and 3 men's lives resting on a single decision made in a single moment. He had taken the time. She waited 4 minutes and 9 seconds. Then she fired. The round traveled across the snow-covered field in the cold morning air and struck the center of the target. Oakes walked to the spotting scope. She looked for a long moment. She straightened. 923 meters, she said. The range was silent. Stahl took 1 step forward. He stopped himself. He stood with his arms at his sides and his head slightly lowered, the posture of a man receiving something he has been carrying toward for a very long time and is not sure he has the right to hold. Finch spoke. Harlow, come with us. The room was Finch's personal office, bookshelves, a wooden desk, a window over the quad where the snow still lay undisturbed. Finch behind the desk, Stahl in the chair to the left, Cassidy across from them both. Finch placed a thin folder on the desk. Read the second page, she said. The document was handwritten. 3 pages, field conditions, language terse and precise. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She read it. Target acquisition confirmed. Conditions: partial cloud cover, intermittent wind from northwest, 14-degree elevation advantage. Equipment: M40 bolt action standard optics. Distance estimated and confirmed by terrain analysis at 1,047 meters. Result mission success. Notes. This engagement is not to be included in any official mission record. Authorization for this operation did not exist at the required congressional level. Inclusion in official documentation would expose the unit to review and potential dissolution. I am placing this record in private keeping. If it is ever found, it will explain itself. She read it twice. Stahl said he made that shot with the same equipment he used in 1971, 1,047 meters. No officially recognized long-range confirmed engagement at that distance by any American military shooter existed until many years later with modern equipment and full support systems. He paused. Your grandfather held that record for decades. He was the only person alive who knew it. He never told anyone, not me, not any other member of the unit. I found this document in his personal effects after he died in an envelope addressed to me. The note with it said 4 words in case it ever matters. Cassidy looked at the document, at her grandfather's handwriting on a page that had traveled from a field somewhere through 50 years of careful keeping to a desk in a pine forest facility in Colorado on a winter morning. She thought about the man who had grown tomatoes in a garden behind a barn in Montana, who had listened to ball games on an old radio and never owned a television, and fixed his own fences and never talked about what he had done before the farm. He had held a record no one knew about for 50 years. He had not told a soul, not because he lacked pride. She understood that now completely. He was proud. He had said so in the letter. But the record was a byproduct of the mission, and the mission had been to bring it to completion and get the right people home alive. And once the mission was done, the record was no longer relevant to the purpose that had produced it. The shooting was never the point. That was what he had been teaching her, every morning on the range. Every hour of patience and stillness and precision. He had not been teaching her how to shoot. He had been teaching her what shooting was, for that capability without purpose is decoration. That precision without judgment is performance. That the greatest skill a person can have is knowing when to use what they carry and when to set it down. Be better than I was, not at the shooting, at everything else. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Then she lowered it. What happens to the record now, she asked. It becomes part of Black Talon's permanent history, Finch said. Declassified. Roland Harlow will be publicly recognized. The full record, the medal, the 1971 mission, this engagement, the complete service history made public to whatever extent classification allows. She paused. There will be a ceremony. The ceremony was held 11 days later in the base's formal assembly hall, flags along the walls, rows of chairs occupied by program personnel, senior officers, retired military, who had known Black Talon's name as a rumor in a corridor, and 2 historians who had spent years working alongside Finch on the declassification effort. Warren Stahl stood at the podium. He had worn the full-dress uniform he had not put on in years. The ribbons and insignia of a career that had begun when one president was in office and ended when the world looked entirely different. He looked like himself and like someone from a long time ago simultaneously, which was entirely accurate. He spoke for 9 minutes without notes. He did not name the places or the operations because most remained classified. He described the nature of the unit's work, the absolute operational silence it required, the months of preparation that served a single hour, the discipline of men who had chosen the hardest available version of service and never sought acknowledgement for the choosing. He described what forms between people who share that kind of work, not camaraderie in the conventional sense, but something deeper and quieter, the bond of men who have trusted each other with their lives in places that appeared on no map that would ever be declassified. Then he spoke about Roland Harlow. He said, I have been asked many times over the course of my career to name the best soldier I ever knew. I always gave the same description. I never gave the name because the name was classified. The description was always this: a man who was extraordinarily capable and entirely uninterested in being known for it. A man who did the most difficult thing in the most difficult circumstances and then went home and grew tomatoes. Something moved through the assembled room, warmer than laughter and older than it. Stahl's voice held through most of it. He held the Medal of Honor in both hands and looked at it for a long time before he looked up. His hands were not entirely steady. Roland, he said, I have been meaning to return this to you for a long time. I am sorry it took this long to find the right way. He stood at the podium and held the medal and did not speak for a moment, holding himself together the way old soldiers hold themselves together, not by suppressing what they feel, but by refusing to let it prevent them from finishing what they came to do. The room was completely still. Cassidy sat in the front row. She watched Stahl hold the medal her grandfather had never wanted anyone to see. She watched his hands, not quite steady, watched him press his lips together, watched the long discipline of a man who had carried a debt for 48 years, reaching the point where it could finally be offered, even if it could not be collected. She did not try to stop what came. There was no reason to. After the ceremony, Stahl found her near the exit. He pressed the Medal of Honor into her hands without speaking first. It was heavier than she expected. Cool metal faded ribbon, the weight of something kept carefully in a specific kind of dark for a long time. He said, "This belongs with you now." She held it with both hands. He said he was a better man than I was, Cassidy. I have known that for 50 years. Whatever he chose freely. No one asked him to protect me. He decided it was right. I have spent my life trying to be worthy of that decision, and I am not certain I have managed it. He looked at her. You have his stillness, he said, the way you stood at the firing line this morning. He used to stand exactly that way, as though the world could do whatever it was going to do, and he would still be there when it finished. He held her hand for a moment before releasing it. Then he turned and walked through the gathered crowd, and she watched him go, and she understood that the debt he was describing was not the kind that closes that what one person chooses to carry for another over decades for no reward, and at significant cost, exists outside the arithmetic of settling accounts. Stahl knew this. He had known it from the beginning. He had lived with it the way her grandfather had lived with his silences, quietly, continuously, without asking to be relieved. The investigation into Donovan Armaments was opened by the Department of Defense Inspector General's office 2 weeks after the ceremony. Finch briefed Cassidy in the same direct way she delivered all information. The investigation faced significant evidentiary challenges, she said. 50 years of elapsed time. Documents lost, destroyed, misfiled across multiple reorganizations. The individuals who had made the central decisions were deceased or beyond current legal jurisdiction. What remained was consistent and strongly circumstantial, sufficient to establish historical truth, insufficient for criminal prosecution under the applicable statutes of limitations. Donovan Armaments, restructured under a parent holding company established 18 months prior, would continue to operate. Blake Donovan faced separate charges under the UCMJ for the armory incident. He would be separated from military service. Proceedings were underway. Cassidy sat with that information. She said, so there is no legal accountability for what happened in 1973. Finch said the historical record has been corrected. Black Talon's reputation has been fully restored in every document that can be amended. The public record of what actually occurred in 1973 now exists and is accessible. That is not the same as a courtroom finding. It is not nothing either. She paused. The truth arrived late. It still arrived. Cassidy looked at the window. She thought about the map with the transposed trail marker and the sabotaged rifle, and the phone call overheard between two walls, the long chain of decisions stretching from a failed equipment contract across 50 years to a training facility in Colorado. How a lie sustained long enough develops its own defenders, its own infrastructure, its own momentum that outlasts everyone who set it in motion. The momentum had stopped. The lie had been named. That was not justice in the full and complete sense. But her grandfather had known the difference between naming a lie and obtaining the full accounting for it, had lived inside that gap for most of his adult life, and had found a way to continue being the person he intended to be regardless. She thought she could live inside that gap too. She thought he had taught her how. Captain Crane submitted a voluntary transfer request to a non-operational administrative role 3 days after the hearing. Approved without comment. Gone from the facility by the end of the week. Cassidy received her program completion certificate on a Friday afternoon in December. Graduated at the top of her class. Master Sergeant Oakes shook her hand and said your grandfather would recognize you. She said it as fact, not compliment. Cassidy said, I think that's the point. Oakes held her hand for a moment. She said he taught you to be patient. He taught you to be precise. He taught you to wait for your body to stop before your mind asked it to. What he could not teach you was judgment. That had to be yours. It is. She released her hand and walked away without further ceremony, which was exactly right. Sergeant Breck Duval drove up from Fort Carson for the graduation. No one had requested it. Protocol did not require it, and he came anyway. He found Cassidy after the formal proceedings ended and shook her hand. He said, I don't know exactly what you've been doing up here for the past year. I know it wasn't easy. I know you did it. He paused, looking at his boots for a moment. He had a son in the 10th Mountain Division at Fort Drum. He called him on Sunday evenings when the week was finished. Since the morning he had raised binoculars and seen 5 shots through a single hole in a paper target, he had been thinking about what it would mean to tell his son the name of the man who had built that skill into a 22-year-old woman across a decade of cold Montana mornings. He thought his son should know that name. He thought the name deserved to be spoken. He said goodbye to Cassidy and drove down the mountain through the early dark. He pulled off at an overlook halfway down where the lights of the base spread across the valley floor, and the sky above was the black that only exists above 8,000 feet in winter, with no artificial light competing with it. He called his son. His son answered on the second ring. Duval said, "I want to tell you about a man named Roland Harlow. You've never heard of him. I hadn't either, not until this year. But I watched his granddaughter shoot this morning, and I think you should know his name, because the people who deserve to be remembered are usually not the ones who end up on monuments." His son said, "Who was he?" Duval looked at the lights below, at the dark mass of the mountains above them, at the particular quality of a clear winter night that has not been argued with by anything human. "He was the best this country ever produced," he said, "and he spent his whole life making sure nobody knew it." He paused. He said, "That's the part that matters. Write it down." The orders arrived at Cassidy's dormitory desk at 0700 on Monday morning. A sealed manila envelope bearing the designation of a unit with no base address in any standard directory. Her first assignment. She had slept well the night before, which surprised her. She had expected the sleep after a ceremony that large, that final, to be restless, to run with the residue of everything the week had contained. Instead, she had gone under fast and clean, the sleep of someone whose account has been settled, at least for now, at least in the ways that this season of her life had required. She opened the envelope at her desk with the winter light flat and white through the pine trees. Standard format, theater of operation, operational parameters, coordination structure. She read through it methodically, page by page, the way she had learned to read everything, not quickly but completely, with the full weight of attention given to every line. She turned to the third page. The supporting intelligence section listed entities relevant to the operations background context. Government agencies, private organizations, a series of corporations identified by function and current operational status. Names she didn't recognize. One she did. Donovan Armaments LLC current status. Active, restructured under a parent holding company, incorporated 18 months prior at a different address under a different registered name. Same principles, same ownership chain. The same machine in a new suit of clothing, moving through procurement channels that had no access to what the old records now said. She read the entry twice. Then she set the page down. On the desk in front of her was the Medal of Honor. She had placed it there 2 nights ago after the ceremony, and it had been the first thing she saw each morning since the pale metal face of it turned upward in the flat winter light, the faded ribbon, the specific gravity of something that had been kept carefully in the dark for a very long time before it was brought into the open. Her grandfather had known that justice and truth are different timelines, that the record can be corrected and the machinery can keep running. That knowing this is not a reason to stop. It is the reason to continue. He had continued for 50 years, with patience and precision and without asking for recognition. He had left her with everything she needed to do the same. She picked up the medal. She held it for a moment, its weight settled in her palm, cool at first and then warming against her skin. She placed it carefully in the inner pocket of her field jacket against her sternum and felt it there, solid, real present, as she stood up from the desk. She picked up the briefing envelope. She walked out of the dormitory into the cold morning air, into the thin highlight of the mountains, into the particular clarity that belongs to elevation in winter. And the first hour after a long decision has been made, she did not look back. Her grandfather had never needed to. Neither did she.